A Reich of 1,000 years. That was Hitler's vision. A fascist empire stretching across continents built on conquest, terror, and genocide. In his mind, the war wasn't about just victory on the battlefield, it was about rewriting human history. But what exactly did he believe would come after the fighting stopped? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're breaking down what Hitler believed would happen after the war. Hitler didn't believe Germany truly lost World War I. In his mind, the nation had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by degenerate politicians, Jews, Marxists, and the so-called cultural Bolsheviks. But under his rule, he imagined Germany rising from the ashes stronger than ever. Fueled by fascism, he dreamed of a world with one hegemon at the top, himself. He would reshape the global order, divide his territories into masters and subhumans, and only then peace would follow. Or so he thought. Central to Hitler's future plans was Lebensraum, or living space. This idea had existed in German nationalistic thought before Hitler, but he made it the heart of Nazi ideology. The German master race needed land to spread their wings, farm, build towns, and multiply. That space lay in the east, the rich farmland and resource belts of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a pipe dream. By the 1930s, Nazi planners were drawing up blueprints. They imagined a vast German empire carved out of the conquered Soviet land. Millions of Slavic people, dismissed by Nazis as subhumans, would be expelled, enslaved, or left to starve. Meanwhile, German settlers occupied and cleared the ground. This was partly laid out in the master plan for the East, put together by Heinrich Himmler's planning staff. It outlined population transfers on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. Entire regions of Poland, Ukraine, and Western Russia were to be cleared out, their people uprooted or wiped out just to make way for the so-called master race. The ethnic Germans would form a new peasant army of colonists with educated Germans overseeing the operations. When Hitler talked about peasants, he wasn't being derogatory. He had a romantic idea about regular people working the land. And the fascists, like most dictatorships, were not big fans of intellectuals. Those German soldier farms would till up the land, marry and raise big families in what he imagined as a racial utopia. Nazi estimates said that 30 to 50 million people might eventually be killed, deported, or enslaved to make this work. The suffering would be unimaginable. The cities of the East, meanwhile, would be flattened and rebuilt in a German style. Hitler's architect Albert Speer even pitched the idea of twin cities, the all-new urban centers modeled after places like Hamburg, Munich, and Berlin, linked by autobahns to the Reich itself. The cities would double as industrial hubs packed with mines, factories, and hydroelectric plants, all for Germany's benefit. In Hitler's first book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Hitler ranted that it couldn't possibly be God's plan for one people to control 50 times more land than another. He was talking about Russia. But interestingly, Russia wasn't always his main target. In the early 1920s, he mused about a potential German-Russian alliance. But of course, that came with stipulations. The Jewish population had to go. His initial hostility focused on France and Britain, the victors of World War I, and the enforcers of Versailles, the treaty that Hitler said torn apart and humiliated what had been a great country. It was a view held by most Germans. So why did Russia suddenly become the ultimate enemy? Historians point to the influence of Alfred Rosenberg, one of the Nazi Party's earliest racial theorists. Rosenberg was a Baltic German who fled the Bolshevik Revolution when he studied in Moscow. He drilled into Hitler's young mind the idea that Bolshevism was nothing more than a Jewish plot. As for the Slavs, he said that they were racially inferior. The Soviet Union was both ideologically and biologically the greatest danger to Germany, and Hitler was on board. By the time Hitler was penning his book in a prison cell in the mid-1920s, he was absolutely convinced Russia was the true foe. In a 1922 interview, he declared that any alliance with the Bolsheviks was impossible, and that Germany's natural partners were fascist Italy and ideally Britain. Yes, Britain. Rosenberg later turned theory into practice. He was appointed head of the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories. He became the man in charge of turning Hitler's vision into reality. Under his watch, millions of Slavs and Jews were condemned to starvation, forced labor, and outright mass murder. Hitler had found in him both an ideological guide and a perfect executor of plans. Hitler's plan for the Slavic peoples wasn't just death, he'd get them to build his new empire. Many would be forced into labor gangs, constructing roads, harvesting crops, and working in the mines. Some would be deported far into Siberia beyond the new German frontier. The soldier peasants, in their place, would form a racially pure people's community bound together not by class but by blood. The Nazi utopia was presented as a kind of classless paradise. No greedy capitalists, no socialist agitators, no aristocrats lording over the people, just healthy Aryan farmers working the soil, raising families under the shadow of the swastika. In Germany, he gave poor people vacations, trips to museums, and a chance to do things that they hadn't done before due to a lack of cash. He called it strength through joy, and it helped build his following. It was real, but his equal society was a fantasy. In reality, Nazi society still relied on rich industrialists, aristocrats, and party elites. There was still an us and a them. Hitler and his generals pored over maps of Ukraine's black earth soil, the Donbass coalfields, Russia's copper, coal, iron ore, nickel, gold, platinum, and the oil of the Caucasus. These resources, the Nazis believed, would guarantee German economic self-sufficiency. No more dependence on world trade. No more vulnerability to blockades. Only a fortress Reich supplying itself from conquered lands. Hitler's fixation on this Eastern Empire was shaped by Germany's painful experience after World War I. Versailles had stripped Germany of territory, colonies, and resources. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression left the Weimar Republic devastated by unemployment, hyperinflation, and despair. To Hitler, this confirmed that Germany could not rely on global capitalism or fair play in international trade. Bankers and economists were all corrupt. He told his people that Germany would never be humiliated again. He promised that the master race would be lifted into prosperity for 1,000 years. In his mind, this was redemption. Germany would be avenged, and a perfect empire would rise from the ashes. Hitler's attitude toward Britain was complicated. On one hand, he admired the Brits and their empire where the sun didn't set. After all, it was proof that an Aryan people could dominate huge parts of the globe, bending foreign populations to their will and get rich off their resources, all while building the sewers, the schools, and hospitals to keep it all running. In Hitler's second book of 1928, unpublished during his lifetime, he even talked about an Anglo-German alliance. Germany would dominate the continent, Britain the seas, and together they could enforce world order. But Hitler's view of the British was coldly pragmatic. Racial cousins who could be useful allies, friendly if they cooperated, enemies to be destroyed if they didn't. In practice, he hoped for a settlement, a peace deal. Early in World War II, he imagined Britain might accept German control of Europe in exchange for the survival of its overseas empire. Even after the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain, he still believed he could persuade the Brits to agree to peace. He had a fantasy of a joint German-British army chasing Americans from Iceland. Britain, he thought, would not want to be dependent on Washington, so out of self-interest it would make a deal with Berlin. He was thinking like a realist in terms of raw power. But Winston Churchill stood in his way, a man born into privilege who lived and breathed for the British Empire. To Churchill, appeasement wasn't a strategy, it was a slow death sentence for Great Britain. The Germans, he thought, would come for Britain at some point. He was very likely right. The Nazis wanted absolute control of Europe to spread fascism far and wide. But if Churchill were gone, thought Hitler, well, Britain might change its mind. After all, plenty of powerful voices in British politics and business had leaned toward siding with Hitler. Some elites openly favored compromise, and Hitler knew all about Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Hitler was on good terms with Mosley. He was a guest of honor at Mosley's second wedding, held at the home of Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. This gave Hitler hope that possibly one day Britain could have a fascist government. Back then, fascism had elements of violence, but it wasn't anywhere near as taboo as it is now. In 1934, the Daily Mail's owner, Viscount Rothermere, even published an article headlined, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts!" After years of Europe grinding through industrial misery, a world war, and then the Great Depression, the continent was deeply divided. Some people really thought fascism or communism was the way to make life better. But if Hitler dreamed of Britain as a partner, he saw the United States as a major threat. Still, like with all of his thinking, there were contradictions. On one hand, he admired certain aspects of the U.S. He respected industrial giants like Henry Ford, who openly promoted anti-Semitic ideas and whose mass production methods had revolutionized manufacturing. Like some other firms on Wall Street, as well as some U.S. banks, Ford had helped Hitler build Germany Mark II. Ford even received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, one of Nazi Germany's highest awards for foreigners. Hitler also admired America's early 20th century eugenics laws, which inspired Nazi racial policies. On the other hand, He despised what he called the mongrel nation, a nation that he believed was run by Jews and plagued by non-white races. In his racial fantasy, a country composed of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Jews, blacks, Asians, could never form a stable civilization. Still, Hitler often spoke of this mongrel America as a real and present danger. Its growing industrial power and imperialist spirit threatened Germany's ambitions in the West. According to the Naval War Staff Diary, Hitler told Admiral Erich Raeder that Germany and Japan must jointly annihilate the United States if it interfered in plans. But other times, he casually dismissed America as decayed, destined to collapse under its own diversity. "I don't see much future for the Americans," he once wrote. Hitler's racial theories demanded contempt for a mixed nation, but his geopolitical instincts recognized that if Germany unified Europe, America would eventually have to respond. History shows that hegemonic powers don't usually coexist peacefully. If one state grows too strong, another will challenge it. It's the way of the world. Sooner or later, a German-dominated Europe and the US would butt heads. One of the most chilling what-ifs in Hitler's imagined post-war world is the atomic bomb. Germany lagged way behind in nuclear research. The Nazi regime distrusted theoretical physics, branding it Jewish science. It never got enough funding, despite there being first-rate physicists, some of them leaving Germany for the States. Britain's tube alloys program pulled off a breakthrough with the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum in 1940. A bomb could be made with kilograms, not tons of fissile material. That changed everything. Suddenly, the atomic bomb stopped being an abstract idea and became an engineering project with terrifying real-world consequences. But what Britain lacked was the industrial capacity to actually build one. And that's why tube alloys was merged with the American Manhattan Project. But what if Hitler and Britain had made peace? Would London have shared its nuclear secrets with Berlin? It's far from certain. Many of Britain's best scientists like Rudolf Peierls or Otto Frisch were Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. They would have never worked for Hitler. In a peace scenario, they might have headed to America, carrying their expertise with them. It's hard to say what would have happened. It would depend on who was in power in the British government, how aligned it was with Germany, or if it was just biding its time to support the USA. Unlike Britain, Nazi Germany, if Hitler's plans in Russia had actually worked, would have had the industrial muscle to build the bomb. With Czechoslovak industry, Romanian oil, and Russian mines under its control, the Reich would have poured resources into uranium enrichment and reactor construction. Slave labor would have powered the effort. It might not have produced a bomb by 1945, but by the 1950s, a German atomic arsenal would become very, very plausible. Pair that with Hitler's fascination with long-range weapons like the Amerika bomber, a proposed strategic bomber meant to hit New York, and it paints a chilling picture. In this nightmare future, Nazi nuclear bombs could be mounted on intercontinental rockets or carried by aircraft and rain destruction on the United States. And that's why it mattered so much that Britain refused to make peace, and why Stalin hurled millions of men into the grinder of the Eastern Front. Even without a bomb, Germany was pushing the boundaries of technology. In some areas, it was vastly superior to the US or UK. That's why Nazi scientists were in high demand after the war. The V-2 rocket, first launched in 1944, was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. In the real timeline, it came too late and in too small of numbers to change the outcome of the war. But with a victorious Reich and years of peace and unlimited resources, rocket programs would have advanced much more rapidly. Also, the Z Plan, a massive naval rearmament scheme that was halted by the war, could have been realized. The plan envisioned dozens of new battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers, creating a navy to rival the Royal Navy and eventually challenge the US with conquered shipyards, raw materials, and conscripted labor. That dream might have become a reality by the 1950s. The US would have been in a very precarious position, despite it being separated by so much ocean. So, what would happen next? If Hitler saw Britain as a potential partner and the United States as a looming rival, he had mixed feelings about Japan. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were allies, but not natural ones. Hitler admired the Japanese soldiers' courage and discipline, but he never considered them equals. The Japanese were not Aryans. At best, they were like honorary members of his club, respected for their military prowess, but ultimately destined to play second fiddle. That meant Japan could be tolerated as a regional hegemon, ruling its co-prosperity sphere in East Asia, but never rising to global leadership. It could have China, The country had the raw potential to be a great power, but by the early 20th century it had been carved up and humiliated by the UK, the US, Japan, and Russia. Decades of resisting international trade and failing to modernize its military left it vulnerable. In Hitler's imagined future, Japan would still wreak havoc across China, and he would have applauded every moment of it. Still, Japan was not Germany's equal, not for Hitler. He claimed that it only grew in power because of the West. Western trade, European science, and Germanic technology had, in his view, given Japan its modern strength. He once said that if Europe and America collapsed, Japan would freeze and sink back into the slumber from which it was awakened 7 decades ago by the wave of Aryan culture. In other words, Japan's rise wasn't his own achievement, it was borrowed, copied. If Germany was top dog in Europe, Japan would still want to rule over much of Asia. Its hunger for oil, rubber, and metals drove it into Southeast Asia. If Germany had defeated Russia, Tokyo might have looked north to Siberia, seizing land but finding little fuel. Either way, friction with Berlin and the US would be inevitable. Beyond Europe and Asia, Hitler's vision also stretched to Africa. In the 19th century, Germany had colonies in places like Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon, but lost them under Versailles. A victorious Reich would have reclaimed and expanded those holdings. Plans for a vast German-controlled bloc in Central Africa had circulated since the Kaiser's day. Under Hitler, the dream would be revived. Germany would seize swaths of Africa, carving out a continental empire that stretched from the Mediterranean down into the resource-rich Congo. Africa's gold, copper, rubber, and oil would feed the Reich's industries. Its people would be reduced to a labor pool, subject to the same racial hierarchy imposed in Europe. Combined with Europe and the Soviet lands, this would give Hitler's Reich control over a vast share of the world's resources: grain, oil, coal, metals, and labor. On paper, it would be a self-sufficient super empire, rivaling anything Rome or Britain had built. It should be said that some historians argue that Hitler would have been content with European domination, and some argue he wanted the world. Hitler believed Germany could dominate the world culturally and ideologically, not just by force. In his 1,000-year Reich, Germans at home would celebrate triumph with vast monuments, arches, and boulevards. Berlin would be rebuilt as Germanica, the capital of the world, crowned with a gigantic domed hall capable of holding 180,000 people. It was architecture as propaganda, designed to awe citizens and foreigners alike. The world would be reminded constantly of German power. Hitler likely imagined fascism, fascist culture, and its economic system could spread across the world. Once his enemies were crushed and the door forced open, he might have believed other nations would naturally fall in line and adopt the German model. This couldn't happen without building a huge defense force. The Reich's military would have expanded to the mightiest on earth, a machine capable of constant interventions to keep the world in line. His world peace would really be a fascist peace, domination backed by threats of blood and covert operations. Once he'd forced his enemies to submit, Hitler planned to spread pro-German ideas through universities, shipping in hand-picked experts. German economists would be sent abroad to push policies that served the Reich's interests, and in many ways it's a mirror of how the United States later spread the gospel of neoliberalism during the Cold War. Great powers can achieve a lot without using force. Germany would have done something similar, creating a global system with it as the winner. History would be rewritten to glorify Aryan achievements in Hitler's new Reich. He would have tried to spread the German language not just in Eastern Europe, but around the world. German cinema, watched all over the world, would serve as propaganda, adopting the good versus evil model. Pre-war systems would have been seen as the devil, Hitler depicted as the savior of mankind. The Nazi version of the good life, the New Order, would be exported far and wide, sometimes with words and ideas, sometimes with violence. If anyone dared disagree, they would be imprisoned. Free speech would be viewed as an element of chaos. But could it really have worked? Hitler liked to talk about peace, but it was peace imposed by violence, a fascist peace. His system required constant repression, endless policing, and the permanent subjugation of millions. History shows that such oppressive empires rarely last. The Soviet Union, Rome, and Britain faced constant resistance from subject peoples. Nazi Germany, with its unparalleled brutality, would have sparked endless rebellions. The cost of maintaining order in the East alone, with millions of Slavs resisting colonization, would have drained the Reich. It would have been a non-stop rebellion as people fought for their cultural roots. For all their flaws, human societies tend to gravitate toward pluralism. People want freedom and dignity. Liberal democracy and free market capitalism are still far more appealing than a system that divides people into masters and subhumans and silences criticism. It has to be fair, or otherwise people start talking about failure and we get ideologues like Hitler. Fascism would have eaten itself in the end because it's not tenable. But had a few pieces been moved into different places, the world could definitely have had a period where fascism gave democracy a run for its money. We've seen what Hitler imagined for the world after the war, but what did his soldiers face? Watch D-Day but from the Nazi perspective to see history's biggest invasion from the other side. Or click on this video instead.